Cairo, August 1992. In a shabby hotel called the Qasr el-Medina, in the Sayyida Zeinab district, an old German man is dying of cancer. The staff know him as Tarek Hussein Farid, a devout Muslim who prays each day at the great mosque of Al-Azhar, who reads for hours in a rocking chair by the window, who has lived among them for years without ever quite explaining where he came from. When he dies, on the 10th of August, he is buried quietly in a cemetery for the poor, the kind where graves are reused after a few seasons because there is no space and no money for anything else. No one at the funeral knows his real name. No one knows that 3 continents away, police files in a quiet German spa town still carry his photograph, or that for 3 decades he has been one of the most wanted men on earth. His real name is Aribert Heim. In the concentration camp records of Mauthausen, in the sworn testimony of survivors, in the files of Simon Wiesenthal's documentation center, he is known by another name entirely, Dr. Death. This is the story of how a man responsible for grotesque cruelty in a Nazi concentration camp built a second life as a respected doctor, was warned just hours before his arrest, and disappeared so completely that the world's best resourced Nazi hunters spent 30 years chasing rumors, sightings, and shadows, while the truth sat largely unnoticed in a rundown Cairo hotel room the entire time. It matters because it says something uncomfortable about the machinery of post-war justice, that determination alone was never enough, and that a single tip-off, delivered at the right moment, could buy a man 3 decades of freedom that his victims never had. By the early 1960s, West Germany faced an accounting it had spent 15 years avoiding. The immediate post-war tribunals at Nuremberg had convicted the most senior architects of the Reich, but they had barely scratched the surface of the machinery beneath them. The camp doctors, the guards, the administrators who had carried out the daily business of murder. Many had simply gone home. Denazification tribunals, overwhelmed and often lenient, had cleared thousands of former SS men to resume ordinary lives, sometimes within a few years of the camp's liberation. The Cold War had, if anything, made the problem worse. Western intelligence services, more interested in anti-communist assets than in war crimes, had occasionally protected former Nazis whose expertise or contacts were judged useful. Prosecutors who did want to pursue cases faced a chronic shortage of witnesses willing or able to testify, of surviving documentation, and of political will. Aribert Heim was, on paper, exactly the kind of case that should have been unwinnable to bury. Born in 1914 in the Austrian town of Bad Radkersburg, the son of a police officer, he studied medicine in Graz and joined the Nazi Party's illegal Austrian branch in 1935, well before the Anschluss made membership convenient. He entered the SS after Austria's annexation and, in October 1941, was posted to Mauthausen concentration camp near Linz for a tenure that lasted barely 6 weeks. It was long enough. Survivors would later describe a doctor who injected petrol, phenol, and other toxic substances directly into the hearts of healthy prisoners to time how quickly each substance killed. One case, recorded in testimony gathered for an Austrian arrest warrant, described an 18-year-old Jewish inmate sent to the camp clinic with a minor foot inflammation. Instead of treating him, Heim reportedly anesthetized the young man, castrated him, and removed both kidneys before decapitating him, later keeping the skull on his desk because, witnesses said, he admired the teeth. Other testimony described organs removed from conscious prisoners without anesthetic, and skin taken from a victim's body, reputedly to be used as furniture covering in the camp commandant's private quarters. These were not vague, decades-old rumors reconstructed after the fact. They came from named survivors, camp hospital orderlies, and fellow prisoners who had watched it happen. And yet, for years, none of it caught up with him. Heim served roughly 2 years in an internment camp after the war, then was cleared by denazification proceedings, a system so overstretched that thoroughness was often a luxury it could not afford. He resumed medical practice, eventually settling in the elegant spa town of Baden-Baden, where he built a respectable career as a gynecologist. He married, had 2 children, and by most accounts became a wealthy man, investing profitably in Berlin real estate. For nearly 2 decades, the butcher of Mauthausen was a pillar of a quiet German community, and nobody who crossed paths with the mild-mannered doctor with the impeccable practice had any reason to suspect what he had done in 6 weeks in 1941. The machinery that finally caught up with Heim was not a single invention, but a slow accumulation of post-war institutions built for exactly this purpose. Central to it was the Central Office of the State Justice Administrations for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, established in Ludwigsburg in 1958 specifically to coordinate the prosecution of cases that individual regional courts had neither the resources nor, often, the appetite to pursue alone. Working alongside it were determined individual investigators, among them a Baden-Baden detective named Alfred Edner, who would spend much of the rest of his career obsessively chasing Heim's trail across Europe and beyond. And looming over the entire effort was Simon Wiesenthal, the Vienna-based Holocaust survivor whose documentation center had, since the 1940s, been compiling the evidence, the addresses, the informant networks that state prosecutors alone could rarely assemble. Wiesenthal placed Heim's name on lists of most wanted fugitives believed to be hiding in Egypt as early as 1967, working from survivor testimony and informant tips that pointed, correctly as it turned out, toward Cairo. The technical apparatus of the hunt was, in truth, unglamorous. Witness affidavits painstakingly gathered from survivors scattered across the world, extradition requests filed and refiled with governments in South America that had little enthusiasm for cooperating, informant tips from Uruguay, Spain, Switzerland, Chile, and Brazil that arrived over decades and led, time after time, nowhere. In 1979, the Baden-Baden State Court indicted Heim in absentia on hundreds of counts of murder. A case built entirely without its defendant present, resting on testimony from men like Karl Lotter, a non-Jewish political prisoner who had worked in the Mauthausen hospital and who described, in harrowing detail decades later, the killing of the 18-year-old footballer. It was evidence strong enough to convict, if only the accused could be found. He very nearly wasn't found in time to be arrested at all. In 1961, German authorities, alerted that Heim was living openly in Baden-Baden under his own name, began building the case that would become the 1962 warrant. When police finally moved to arrest him in September that year, they arrived at his home to discover he had gone, apparently tipped off by a source that has never been definitively identified, mere hours or perhaps a single day before the warrant was to be executed. He fled the country using a temporary alias, reportedly passing through Turkey before continuing onward. From that moment, Aribert Heim effectively vanished. What followed was 3 decades of near misses, false leads, and outright myth. Sightings were reported in Uruguay, in Chile, in Spain, in Argentina. In 1982, an Israeli Air Force colonel named Danny Baz would later publish a memoir claiming Heim had been hunted down and executed by a clandestine Jewish vigilante group calling itself the Owl, a story that made for a dramatic book but was never substantiated. In 2005, rumors placed him in Spain. Ephraim Zuroff, who succeeded Wiesenthal as the Simon Wiesenthal Center's chief Nazi hunter, traveled personally to Patagonia in 2008, convinced Heim might be hiding among the German communities of southern Chile or Argentina, and publicly urged the aging fugitive, then believed to be 94 if still alive, to surrender. None of it was true. The real answer, all along, was Cairo. If you're finding this story as unsettling as I do, a quick subscribe helps more than you'd think. It costs nothing, and it tells me you'd like more of these. The Heim case sits alongside a small cluster of similarly infamous disappearances, and the contrasts between them are instructive. Adolf Eichmann, the chief logistical architect of the Holocaust, escaped to Argentina under a false identity, but was tracked, surveilled for weeks, and ultimately abducted from a Buenos Aires street by Israeli Mossad agents in 1960. A state-sponsored operation with the full resources of a nation behind it, ending in a public trial and execution. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor whose crimes bear the closest resemblance to Haim's own, spent decades hiding across Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, protected in part by sympathetic expatriate communities, and died by drowning off the Brazilian coast in 1979, his death unconfirmed for a further 6 years until forensic testing of exhumed remains settled the matter in 1985. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, was sheltered for decades in Bolivia, in his case with the tacit protection of a government that found his intelligence background useful, before journalists Serge and Beata Klarsfeld finally exposed him and secured his extradition to France in 1983. What distinguishes Haim's case is not the crime, seemingly never connected the mild, aging German hotel resident with the war criminal on Interpol's list. The eventual unraveling, when it came, owed less to traditional detective work than to old documents and family testimony. In February 2009, the German broadcaster ZDF, working jointly with the New York Times, reported that they had located a briefcase left behind in the Cairo hotel room where the man known as Tarek Hussein Farid had lived out his final years. Inside were more than 100 personal papers, a passport, a residence permit application, bank slips, personal letters, medical documents, and handwriting analysis matched them to Aribert Haim. Haim's son, Rudiger, who had for years publicly maintained he had no contact with his fugitive father, eventually acknowledged visiting him in Cairo repeatedly from the mid-1970s onward, including caring for him after a cancer operation in 1990. Dust analysis on the briefcase indicated it had spent years in a North African environment. A reissued Egyptian death certificate dated to the correct period listed the death of Tarek Hussein Farid on the 10th of August, 1992. Even so, the case did not close cleanly. Ephraim Zuroff, who had devoted years of his career to the hunt, publicly expressed skepticism, noting that the story relied heavily on the testimony of a son with a considerable financial interest in having his father declared dead. Rudiger Haim stood to gain access to more than $1.5 million in investments held in his father's name. Zuroff pointed out, pointedly, that the one thing missing from the entire account was a body. Cairo's cemeteries for the poor reuse graves after a matter of years, meaning no remains could realistically be recovered to provide final forensic confirmation. German investigators traveled to Egypt hoping to establish definitive proof, but the passage of time had erased what physical evidence might once have existed. It was not until 2012, a full 2 decades after his actual death and 50 years after he first vanished, that a German court formally declared Aribert Haim dead, closing a file that had remained open for half a century. The impact of the case was, in the end, almost entirely symbolic rather than material. Haim was never tried, never sentenced, never made to answer publicly for what survivors described him doing at Mauthausen. No courtroom drama, no cross-examination, no moment of reckoning of the kind that gave the Eichmann and Barbie trials their historical weight. What the case left behind instead was a study in the limits of post-war justice. A reminder that even with dedicated investigators, an international documentation network, decades of institutional will, and eventually the resources of a major newspaper and television broadcaster, a single, well-timed warning and a genuinely unpredictable choice of destination could keep a man beyond reach for the rest of his natural life. It also illustrated something less discussed, that hiding in plain sight, under a wholly new identity, integrated into a community that never thought to question him, proved more effective across 30 years than any of the more elaborate escape routes and safe houses used by other fugitives. Haim's story, along with those of Eichmann, Mengele, and Barbie, has since been the subject of books including Nicholas Coolish and Soad McKennett's account, The Eternal Nazi, and the case remains one of the standard reference points cited by historians studying the machinery and the failures of Nazi hunting in the decades after the war. Cairo, August 1992. An old man dies quietly in a rundown hotel room, mourned by neighbors who knew him only as a devout, orderly, slightly private German, who had converted to Islam and made a modest life among them. They bury him in a pauper's grave that will, within a few years, be reused for someone else, erasing the last physical trace of him from the earth. thousands of miles away, in Germany, in Austria, in the files of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, his name remains open, active, urgent, a warrant nobody can serve, a debt nobody can collect, a face on posters offering rewards for information about a man who has already been dead for years without anyone realizing it. He got away with it, not through cunning escape networks or foreign intelligence protection, not through the kind of dramatic flight that fills spy novels, but through the simple, devastating effectiveness of disappearing so completely that even the most determined hunters in the world were, for 30 years, looking everywhere except where he actually was. Dr. Death died. Tarek Hussein Farid prayed at Al-Azhar mosque until the end and took his real name almost to the grave with him. And in doing so, he outran justice more completely than almost any other war criminal of his generation. That, in the end, is the story of Aribert Haim. Not a manhunt that succeeded, but one that never truly ended at all.